It is actually a far deeper rabbit hole. At the end of the day, none of this is actually new. The sky isn't falling. Women haven't changed, men haven't changed, and despite what you might think, the lopsided social contract between men and women hasn't changed that much either. What we are seeing is the same old petty gender antagonism it's always been. The only difference is that, like the prevalence of high fructose corn syrup leading to obesity problems, the modern human environment has shifted in such a way that certain innate human social behaviours, particularly those of negative socialisation, have been amplified. 100 years ago, she would have handed you a white feather and called you a coward in front of your friends. Today, she will post your picture on Twitter and call you a misogynist in front of 50,000 people. Welcome to the current year, same as it ever was, just bigger. October 21st, 2015 was the date that Doc Brown and Marty McFly were supposed to arrive in the future, and everyone jokingly complained, "Where's my hoverboard and self-lacing Nikes?" Everyone was so busy asking what happened to the future that was promised to them in 80s sci-fi films that they missed what was happening right under their noses. Futurists and transhumanists talk wistfully about this technological singularity that's going to happen at some unspecified point in the future. I think we've already missed the boat. I think we've actually already experienced something of a technological singularity. We just weren't paying enough attention at the time to realise it. We wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. I laughed my arse off when I first read that quote. I have never liked Twitter, and it seemed a rather poignant statement about the complacent slump in new technologies. But over time, the punchline has lost something of its charm. I think I seriously underestimated the impact and importance of Twitter. I think Peter Thiel may have as well. A stupid, adolescent celebrity in California can tweet whatever fucking nonsense pops into his head, and seconds later, that same thought will be shared halfway around the world in places as remote as the Serengeti with someone who has never even met the original progenitor of that thought. Twitter is not just some rinky-dink social network. For all intents and purposes, it is a primitive form of human telepathy. We are living at a time when human thoughts are being shared and human minds are being connected in ways that we couldn't even fathom 100 years ago, when white feathers of shame had to be physically handed to individual men on street corners. What we have effectively constructed is a fully functional global human hive mind. 3.2 billion people, all digitally connected to form an emergent human superorganism of collective knowledge and consciousness. The problem is that the philosophers and creators at the frontier of this digital human thought network never stopped to consider how this technology would end up being driven by our already existing biological behaviours and biases. In typical hubris, we just assumed that this new technology would magically open up whole new vistas of enlightened human thought. For some reason, it never even occurred to us that this gargantuan technological hive mind would be every bit as irrational and gynocentric as the individual human minds that make up its collective whole. Wikipedia stands as a shining example of this hubris. An open repository to crowdsource all human knowledge for the betterment of mankind. What a wonderful and amazing concept, but who could have guessed that as little as a decade and a half later, and in spite of their supposedly neutral point of view practices, its executive body, the Wikimedia Foundation, would be not just endorsing, but actively funding feminist wiki editing campaigns to intentionally insert pro-female bias into the content of this open encyclopedia in hopes of making it more palatable to female sensibilities. In the words of Tyler Durden, what the fuck did you think was going to happen? Honestly, what did you think was going to happen? How did you really expect this to play out? We've constructed a functional human hive mind, but we never stopped to consider the ramifications of how that hive mind would ultimately reach a consensus on particular issues. Surprise! The collective hive mind reaches a consensus the same way its irrational individual minds do. At virtually every stage of human existence, we have seen the same reproductive gender biases across the species. DNA data showing large gender disparities in effective population size across both pre- and post-agrarian societies, meaning that at a conservative estimate, twice as many women over our evolutionary history have reproduced and passed on their DNA compared to men. Throughout antiquity, we hear stories about entire nations going to war because of a single woman like Helen of Troy. In modern history, even before women got the vote, it was the tender years doctrine, women and children first on the Titanic, suffragettes taking time away from their political campaigning to hand out white feathers. And today, we have Twitter. What has, in my opinion, come to be the de facto central nervous system of modern society. That may sound like an exaggeration, but compare it to almost any other competing digital communication platform. Even simple videos can be difficult to produce, meaning that YouTube has a rather high barrier to entry. Written blogs also require a lot of mental energy expenditure to read and write. Social media networks like Facebook and Google+ tend to keep their content isolated to connected groups of immediate friends and acquaintances. But Twitter is a different beast entirely. Here we have an open forum limiting the content to 140 character messages with a model designed almost entirely around disseminating these messages on the basis of majority consensus via a very clever system of popular retweeting and trending hashtags. It is a shit system for exploring or debating big ideas, but from an information sciences perspective, I cannot think of a better network design to quickly and efficiently distribute packets of social information to be processed across the collective hive mind. In this sense, Twitter could essentially be thought of as a very efficient human communication API for social multi-threading. The question is, what makes up the actual content of these digital packets of social information being distributed across the hive mind? According to a study which tracked emotional trends on the social network Weibo, essentially the Chinese government-approved version of Twitter, anger spreads between users as a direct result of interaction much more quickly and much more widely than any other emotion. When someone tweets news that angers them, that news, along with the angry sentiments accompanying it, are far more likely to be retweeted compared to happy or sad news. Anger, it seems, spreads like an emotional wildfire through social networks, meaning that the emergent primary function of the social network as a mass communication tool is actually for people to express and share outrage, thus, intentionally or not, engaging in mass negative socialization. Human behavioural biology has not changed in any meaningful or significant way. The internet has simply helped to streamline these innate human social tendencies and scale them up in a previously unfathomable way. And over here on the other side of the bamboo curtain, Twitter is at the centre of this. As I said, compared to all the competing methods of online communication, Twitter is the most refined for social multi-threading across the internet's hive mind. So it's no surprise that it's been adopted by virtually everyone, from Joe Nobodies to celebrity entertainers, multinational corporations, and federal politicians. That entire CNN blackmail debacle mentioned earlier all happened because the fucking President of the United States retweeted some GIF originally posted by an anonymous Redditor. Simply catching a glimpse of the president used to be a big deal, but there are no 6 degrees of separation anymore. The old monolithic structure of social governance has been made effectively obsolete and replaced with a new parallel system, where everyone can now directly communicate with everyone else on the same level. The authoritarian structures that now exist within this social framework are no longer the heads of state, but rather the social trends that organically emerge from this collective consensus. And what tends to organically emerge from this collective consensus are our underlying socio-biological behavioural biases, disproportionately anger, and specifically anger at anything that even remotely affects women in some negative way. Case in point, Gamergate. Women are apparently an oppressed minority, gamers are dead, and if you disagree at any point, you're a woman-hating misogynist. Anti-Gamergate is very clearly an authoritarian movement with all of the classic hallmarks. Dubious claims of victimhood followed by idea suppression through systemic othering based on identitarian group bias. But it is not one with an ideological leader or defined mandate that was voted for or even seized power. It is an oppressive, authoritarian social movement that organically grew out of mass social media consensus, ultimately rooted in our biologically innate and irrational concern for women. The federal government of my own country has already started to revoke travel visas on the basis of social media campaigns and online petitions. What type of individuals find themselves the subject of these social media campaigns? That evil misogynist rapper Tyler the Creator, wife-beater Chris Brown, and wicked anti-abortion activist Troy Newman. I don't even agree with everything that these individuals stand for, but do any of these three men really pose a serious security threat to the Commonwealth of Australia? Because the only real threat I see posed by these three men is a threat to the collective feelings of Australian women. However, with enough traction on social media, that on its own is enough of a reason for federal governments to start revoking visas. What happened to the future? Well, we missed it, didn't we? We thought it was just 140 characters, but traditional politics became obsolete right under our noses. At some point, Western civilization underwent a massive paradigm shift from representative democracy to direct democracy, and nobody even noticed. This is what 100,000 people marching on Washington used to look like. This is what 100,000 people marching on Washington looks like today. New digital platforms have expanded the methods of political engagement in such a way that you don't even need to turn off Netflix and leave the comfort of your couch to protest against the government. The barrier to political engagement has basically hit zero. When we think about the age of rebellion, we tend to think about the hippie era. The 2-decade-long Vietnam War saw hundreds of millions of dollars and, more importantly, hundreds of thousands of innocent lives wasted. On November 15th, 1969, the largest anti-war protest in American history saw 500,000 people take to the streets to protest young men being forcibly conscripted by their government to fight and die in somebody else's civil war happening halfway around the globe. The protests frankly didn't achieve much politically speaking, but it seemed a reasonable enough position to take against the government. Fast forward a few decades and we see the 2017 Women's March. Undisputedly, the largest single protest in American history by a rather wide margin, all because some narcissist fucking halfwit made the ham-fisted yet true statement that if you're rich and powerful and successful enough, women will let you grab them on the pussy. To this day, American men still have to sign the Selective Services Register on their 18th birthday. But a poorly worded statement about the hypergamous reproductive interests of women? Well, you can't just go around saying that sort of thing, don't you know? And at an estimated 3.3 to 4.6 million protesters across the US, boy oh boy did the women let us know. Now, I don't think this really represents a significant change in human behaviour between 1969 and 2017. I think new technology has simply brought a significant undercurrent of negative female sentiments that have always existed to the surface. In other words, same old behaviour, but it allowed a large-scale refocusing of social priorities. Back in the 60s, the Vietnam War was in everyone's faces. In Congress, on the streets, in music, on people's televisions. It was a widely recognised issue that people could rally around. Before the internet, however, there really wasn't an adequate platform for individual women to get together en masse and air their collective grievances, their collectively perceived microaggressions, if you will. As soon as the internet, along with services like Twitter, provided women a platform to do this, it turns out that on an aggregate societal scale, The combined collective grievances of women, regardless of how petty and inane, snowball to become a much bigger social issue than a single war that was happening somewhere in Southeast Asia. Today, you don't need a war. You just need a catchy hashtag like everyday sexism for people to rally around. Human social biology is a lot bigger than a fucking paper ballot that happens every 4 years. And that underlying social biology is exactly what this nascent technology allowed people to express. An organic, grassroots reformation of social structure and governance.